Good afternoon and welcome to today's panel discussion, Confronting the Audition Process in American Orchestras, a challenge for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Timothy Brown, Education and Community Engagement Manager at the Hartford Symphony Orchestra and moderator for today's event. I first want to thank the HSO for hosting this panel. The Hartford Symphony Orchestra is deeply committed to becoming an anti-racist orchestra. You can view our DEI commitments and watch a recording of our last panel, Confronting Anti-Black Racism in American Orchestras, on the HSO website. A special thanks goes to my colleagues Julie Jarvis and Amanda Savio for their tireless work in making today's event possible. Throughout today's panel, I encourage you, the viewer, to post your comments and questions in the chat. We'll address as many of your questions as possible during today's session. Also, a recording of today's panel will be available on HSO To Go and the HSO Facebook page later this week. And now, it's my honor to introduce our esteemed panel. Dr. Abram Bush is Senior Associate Dean of Institute Studies at the Peabody Institute, where she oversees all elements of the curriculum and personnel for the academic and applied study areas, including faculty affairs, academic affairs, ensemble operations, and the author of Friedheim Music Library. Dr. Bush has led the development of the Peabody's breakthrough curriculum, which fully integrates music leadership and community engagement learning into the core training of student musicians. Welcome, Abra.
Thank you, Timothy.
Dworkin is President and Artistic Director of the Sphinx organization, the nation's leading organization transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. A musical thought leader and cross-sector strategist driving national programming that promotes diversity in classical music, Ms. Dworkin's work supports a variety of arts organizations, including the Association of Performing Arts Professionals, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and the League of American Orchestras. Welcome, Afa.
Great to be here.
Jeri Lynn Johnson is founder and artistic director of the Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra, an orchestra that serves as a model for the 21st century by combining artistic excellence with cultural diversity and meaningful community engagement. Since becoming the first Black woman to win the prestigious Taki Alsep Conducting Fellowship in 2005, Ms. Johnson has broken barriers in the US and Europe as the first African-American woman on the podium for many orchestras. Welcome to you, Jeri.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here.
Jaroslaw is Assistant Principal, Second Violin, and Personnel Manager at the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. In addition to being a sought-after artist and educator, Mr. Liss serves as Music Director and Conductor of the Chamber Orchestra of Music Academy International in Trentino, Italy, and is on the faculty of Connecticut College, Trinity College, and Hart School Community Division. Welcome to you, Rocke.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Timothy.
And Kai Rocke is currently a Rosemary and David Good Bassoon Fellow with the Minnesota Orchestra, where he performs with the orchestra, takes private lessons, and sits on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. A native of Virginia, Mr. Rocke received his bachelor's degree at the New England Conservatory and a master's degree at Rice University, both in bassoon performance. Welcome to you, Kai.
Thanks, glad to be here.
And welcome to you all. Thank you again for joining us. Let's get right into it. Today, many orchestras are working to improve racial and ethnic representation on stage, but disagree on the best approach to diversify their membership. Last summer, Anthony Tomasini, the chief classical music critic at the New York Times, called for an end to so-called blind auditions in order to increase racial diversity on stage. While the blind audition has been hailed as the fairest process for hiring musicians and widely credited for improving gender equality in orchestras, it has failed to have a similar impact in diversifying the racial and ethnic makeup of American orchestras. According to the League of American Orchestras, only 3% of orchestral musicians in the US are either Black or Latinx. In order to better reflect the communities that they serve, Dr. Tomasini suggested that orchestras, quote, drop the screen and consider a musician's background and experiences in addition to their artistry when making hiring decisions. While it's important to consider the merits and limitations of the blind audition, a more basic question is, are current orchestras' hiring practices serving their intended purpose to hire the best person for the job, especially given the evolving role of orchestra musicians in society? So the questions are, should musicians' hiring practices be changed to increase racial and ethnic diversity in American orchestras? And if so, how? What is the role of the orchestra musician in today's society? And how are students being prepared for a successful career in a professional orchestra? Over the next 90 minutes, we'll explore all these issues and more. Afa, I'd like to turn to you first, please, for a little context about the blind audition. How and when did this process start? What were its goals, and how effective has it been in meeting those goals?
Sure, great question. So the practice of so-called blind auditions dates back to the 1970s. And I think, in short, however laudable maybe the initial goals, we have to say that looking back from the 1970s, as you shared, there has been notable progress made in terms of representation of women in American orchestras. Whether or not those can be entirely or largely attributed to blind auditions, I think there are many interpretations of that specific theory. But I think importantly, we have to say that the idea there was to, in fact, create a mechanism for meritocracy and to anonymize the process so that so as not to then separate people by the way in which they look and the gender they represent, etc. What we can also say is that the name of blind auditions is probably a bit misleading at best. The practice of auditions that has been launched in the 70s, maintained and evolved, and is practiced today is not truly a practice that can in any way be called blind auditions. In that, blind auditions would entail provisions that would ensure that the entire process is anonymous. Not only are we behind the screen, the process of even getting behind the screen would be anonymized and then randomized, and then the screen would be held up. Apart from one or two major orchestras in the country, by and large, that's not the practice. So I think right off the bat, my suggestion is throw away the nomenclature. We don't hold blind auditions. We hold some variation thereof. Before the opportunity to get behind the screen, someone will have reviewed my resume, would have made an assessment behind my name, would have made certain assumptions about my heritage, my background, where I come from, and therefore either made a recommendation to either put me forward or not. So there's that. And if we're bringing the screen down during any portion of the audition, that already, the anonymity is also then removed. So I think the question in front of us now, after we've kind of made peace and ideally agreed to the fact that we don't use blind auditions by and large, with the exception of maybe the Met and maybe one or two other orchestras, then one of the things we must ask ourselves is, we're not using blind auditions, we're using some hodgepodge version of it. Our representation hasn't made much progress, certainly statistically speaking. Our orchestras are suffering from a great deal of divide and separation between between the community in which we reside and that which is on stage. And now we are at a point in our country's history when we're saying we wish to be more representative, and we're now asking for more results. So a quick summary of all of that would point to, if we are wishing for different results but are continuing to follow the same processes, we're not so likely to be successful. we should probably call for some sort of rethinking of the process. So in my mind, the rethinking of the process can take on many different roles. If I even remotely pretended that I knew the absolute answer, I wouldn't be so transparent. So my own thinking on this is that one of the ways to potentially revise a process is that if we're going to insist, or if a large enough faction in our industry is insisting that blind auditions are so important, then I think we only view the blind auditions as one process, one step of the process, which assesses or ascertains someone's readiness to enter a musical collective. That is the orchestra of year 2021. Hopefully we're past 2020 in our heads. So blind auditions would be one, but even if that is one step, then by all means, the audition should be entirely blind. But if we're saying that that's only one step, what are some of the most important qualities and characteristics that an orchestra may be seeking in an ideal candidate? In my mind, that could be one's ability or fitness to serve as a community ambassador, as a teaching artist, as a liaison, as a catalyst, as a citizen. All of those elements and qualities cannot possibly be measured or assessed or contemplated within 6 minutes behind the screen, and even the 2 minutes that you take away the screen. And on top of that, what I think is also extremely important is one's ability and qualifications to assess that readiness within a candidate also cannot be done by people who aren't representative of that community and do not have the fluency of what those qualities would take. So as such, my ultimate recommendation to orchestras is to say that if diversity and representation is important, then by all means prioritize it. If it's important, then commit a percentage of your season to be specifically by non-white composers. And since we're talking about a very specific problem here in the country, commit for a certain percentage, even a graduated goal of starting at 15%, to be music by Black and Brown composers. If diversity is so important, then by all means look at the process you're following and see what you're not measuring, what you're not tracking, and incorporate that into the process. If it is so important, then by all means, let's commit our actual budget dollars toward gaining those competencies we don't have, to really work toward a more representative orchestra. And I think it all comes down to those very specific commitments and goals that I would encourage my many friends in the orchestral world to make now, but for a period of time that is significant and serious. So I would not say this is something we experiment with for a season. We make a commitment for 5 to 10 years and really in a sustained manner, pilot it, pioneer it in good faith, and see if that makes an actual difference.
Thank you, Afa, for both the context and also, for some of the suggestions that you've just shared. I want to go to you, Kai, because you're out there on the circuit, taking auditions, and I know from previous conversations that you've done nearly a dozen auditions throughout the country over the last few years. What has been the process that you've experienced most generally, both in terms of the screen, but also in terms of what Afa was just talking about, screening for other qualities besides artistry?
Yeah, so in the auditions that I've taken, excluding the fellowship that I'm doing currently, there have been behind the screen for the first 2 rounds. In one audition, the screen did come down for the final round, and I can't speak to the other auditions that I've taken in the final round because I didn't make it that far. But I definitely agree with Afa's sentiments that the blind audition process is not entirely true, and that the screen does come down at parts of the audition. For the audition for the fellowship that I'm currently doing in Minnesota, there was no screen, and there was actually an interview that I did after I passed the first round, and I thought that was a very interesting thing to do because it helped me to get to know the people that I could potentially be working with, the environment that I was in, and the receptiveness that they have to having, a person of color in, a very predominantly white ensemble.
I appreciate that. And Kai, just in full transparency, we know that you auditioned with the HSO, last season for Bassoon. In your experience, and I know you said that you didn't necessarily make it to the final round, but does the screen is the screen a benefit for auditioning musicians, or is it a limitation? I know you said for the internship had no screen, or for the fellowship, I'm sorry, but for most actual job placement, there is a screen. So what's your opinion about the use of the screen?
So I have two sort of fighting opinions, and I've talked to some of my colleagues about this as well. I want to say that it's sort of in the orchestra's hands to sort of make the decision. Now, I think that there is a statement like it should be overall, we should start from the level of audition should be blind. Like I think that should be, I think that's something that orchestras should agree with across the board. But if they're committed to addressing a specific set of issues, as Alpha was saying, then that should be, then maybe they should consider those things in the audition process and how they are trying to identify someone for their orchestra.
And Yark, I'd like to go to you next. So help us to understand, what's the audition process at the Hartford Symphony Orchestra? You're obviously a musician in the orchestra and have auditioned many times throughout your career, but you're also the personnel manager and are heavily involved with our audition process. So can you share with us, what's the process at the HSO?
Thank you, Timothy. So when I auditioned for the orchestra, this has been really very long time ago, like, almost before the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. So at that point, there was no screen for the final round. But from maybe middle 2000s, I'm trying to think of it exactly, but I would say for sure for the last 10 years, all the rounds have been screened. And then the urging for this came from the unions, and basically to provide completely blind process. Having said that, I've been auditioning for different orchestras at different point of my professional career, and it's certainly not a very pleasant process in general. Very costly. Attending auditions that are far away and things like this, preparing for an audition, and then just playing for the very, very short period of time. So I have very serious doubts if that process even really gets the best possible applicants, because I've a few times when I actually was sitting on the audition panel, I would once you get to the finals, you have certainly more than one person that is qualified to do this job. And the way I feel is that there is not only just this one person that is able to do this job. There's really so in that sense, I agree with Tomasini, and then I know that this offended a lot of people, but I agree with him that on a certain professional level, there is many people that can do this job well, and then because of the role of the orchestra has been getting transformed lately, and musicians are being asked to do different sets of duties and activities, that therefore it shows even in more relief the weakness of the current system, because this system is really zeroed in on the meritoric aspect of it, and in a very, very narrow sense, right? If you have a very, very good exceptionally good player, but they are supposed to be ambassador to the community, and they are supposed to talk about music, and then they are unable to do that, then certainly there's some sort of distance here. So having said that, I don't know what the exact the good really process is, because if you get so many applicants, right? If you get I recall easily trombone audition with a 70 people coming, they were already pre-selected after the resume round, So how do you audition that many people and give them, a fair, that's a real problem. However, I think the future is, probably somewhere with a model that includes the interview, that includes the personal contact with the candidate. And also, I just wanted to mention, because I'm not sure if I'll have a chance to do it later, but for the people that follow the history of affirmative action, it's been proven that affirmative action works. Okay, certain politicians have always tried to campaign against that, and then get elected even on that premise. But there's this great number amount of evidence that affirmative action works, and therefore maybe we should learn from this from this process. And then if you invite certain percentage of minorities, then obviously you're going to have your result is going to be more likely hiring a minority musician. But if you think that everything is going to just get fixed by, as Afa mentioned, just doing the same process over and over, then it's certainly not true. And then there was even a study where when at first affirmative action was being implemented, and then the federal agencies of the government, the ones that were following affirmative actions, they have shown significant improvement in their representation, of minorities and women, and the companies that were private and that did not follow those guidelines had a significantly lower quota. So just wanted to put it out there, because I think there is definitely something in that issue.
So you're raising lots of points. I see some comments in the chat, that we can get into in a minute around the affirmative action component. But Jeri, I want to come to you, because you've taken sort of a novel approach in terms of starting your own orchestra. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about what led you to actually create the Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra, as well as what is your hiring process you use for musicians there?
Sure. Well, I started Black Pearl in really seeds of it in 2007 and kind of more fully bloomed in 2008. And it is really germane to this conversation to go back to what everyone has been talking about and Dr. Tomasini referred to as, the screen. Conductors audition in a slightly different manner than musicians do. There is no screen for conductors when we are auditioning to be music directors for an orchestra. And so they know what they're getting the minute you step on the podium, or they see a conducting video and they kind of select you from that process. In my case, I had just fresh off of, working with Marin Alsop and the Taki Alsop Conducting Fellowship, really wonderful, all around the world, great experiences, auditioning for a number of orchestras, 3 of which I made it to the final round. So I was one of 3 finalists and did not get selected for any of them. What was really helpful in this process was the feedback that I was able to get from one of the selection committees. The chairperson reached out and to the other 2 people, 2 people who had not won the position, and said, if you would like feedback, we're happy to offer that to you. And that doesn't always happen. I'm not sure if for musicians, if you get feedback or can receive that from committees, but it doesn't always happen for conductors. And so it was very welcome, again, as a young conductor, to hear, what did I do right, or what could I improve upon for the next audition. And so when I spoke with the gentleman, he was really very friendly and complimentary, said the orchestra loved my conducting and the board thought I had great ideas that would be wonderful to work with. And what he said was, we just didn't know how to market you. And I didn't understand what he meant. Perhaps that was naive on my part. So when I asked him to clarify, he literally said, you do not look like what our audience expects the conductor to look like. And, you have to think, shocking to hear that out loud, that someone would admit that, rather than being dismayed by that. I was infuriated by it. And I say that because, you know, that kind of anger, that kind of righteous indignation can be really useful for making, you know, systemic change. And so that was, you know, I never wanted to be a music entrepreneur. I didn't want to start my orchestra. I hate paperwork and the IRS, but you got to do what you got to do when you're forming a nonprofit. And so I started Black Pearl. And what was so, I remain grateful for that difficult conversation, because it led me to understand that there was no amount of accomplishment that was ever going to change my gender or my race in people's eyes from an opportunity standpoint, and that I was outside the system. And so that led me to create an orchestra that simply did not conform to the rules of that system. I don't believe that you know, orchestras should segregate their programming by educational and community programming versus concert programming, because what ends up happening is it becomes a de facto segregation of audiences. And so there's a lot of practices that I think people believe are artistically based, but are really based in a lot of unconscious bias. And so they see that playing out in a lot of the processes that Afa and Jeri and Kai and have talked about, and how these things play out in the way diversity is created or frustrated in orchestral institutions. And so I created Black Pearl from the outset of diversity will be a hallmark of our institution, because we recognized that in the city of Philadelphia, which is at least 60% African-American and Latinx, to not be able to create an ensemble that welcomes those audiences into the concert hall is not just a moral problem, it is a business problem. You're literally leaving money on the table by not including 60% of the 5th largest city in America in your concert hall. This is about money. This was a business decision. Diversity is and will always be good business. There have been, oh, we have a guest approaching. I'm so sorry. No.
All good.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
All good.
Honor. Thank you. Bye. And so, apologies, everyone on the panel and the audience. But that became a mission critical. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate. She is very sweet. Yes, real life. You know, this is part of my vision, and so, you know, there were a lot of ways I could have addressed this. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to make sure that when I say diversity in an American orchestra, that my orchestra truly reflects diversity. There are African-American, Latinx, Asian, people of European descent, you know, transgender, you know, all kinds of diversity, because it isn't just about the descriptive kinds of diversity that people get stuck with in terms of statistics, cultural, racial, and ethnic kinds of things. There also needs to be a broader sense of what diversity is, and the fact that that's a relational description about communities and the orchestras, and that it changes. What may be diverse, you know, for the Detroit Symphony may not be the same thing as, say, the Hartford Symphony, or for you know, the Philharmonic in Idaho or in Alaska, or these kinds of things. And so it's really important for orchestras to understand that there is no fixed definition of diversity, that it is a relational configuration between that orchestra and the community. And so that's what I tried to embody through our work. And from the audition process, what I decided to do is I had a background. I was with the Chamber Orchestra of Philadelphia for years, and so I knew a lot of musicians. And the blessing of being positioned in Philadelphia from a musical standpoint is that up the road we have Juilliard and Manus and all those great institutions in New York. Of course, we have Curtis Institute. Many of my dear friends working there, teaching there. Right here in our backyard. And then a little further down, we have great Peabody, as Abra can speak to. And so we are situated in a very ideal position to have the best classical musicians that have been trained in this country and are coming from other countries are coming here to train. And so to not have a diverse orchestra geographically where we're located is a conscious decision. You cannot say that we don't know where these musicians are. They're right in your backyard. They're trained at your institutions. And so for me, the pipeline issue is a very complicated one. I agree from an educational standpoint, the things that AFA and Sphinx and organizations are doing is critically important to make sure that people are aware of the pipeline and that that pipeline is effective in getting those musicians to those orchestras. However, it can also be used as a smokescreen to say that, you know, we just can't find these musicians and therefore we cannot diversify, when in fact, Black Pearl has proven not only are these musicians here, they are super awesome and they're available, and please pick off our people. We've had a number of people who've auditioned for the Met that used to play with Black Pearl. I'm a little jealous. We miss them, but we wish them well. And that's what we'd like to see. We like to see that from, and I've seen some of the comments in the panelists, and it is critically important. People like to put this argument out there that diversity, the goals of diversity and the goals of artistic excellence are mutually exclusive. And what Black Pearl has proven through the numerous and regular grants from the National Endowment of the Arts, those two things are not mutually exclusive. They can actually be very beneficial to the artistic excellence of an organization.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, for our audition process, we don't audition. Sorry, that was the other part of your question. We actually, I know a lot of people, they know a lot of people. What we ask our core musicians to do is to keep your eye out for people who are talented, who have the right mindset, who have multiple skills like Afa and Yurik and Kai have talked about. Are you able to relate to the community? Are you an awesome teaching artist? Are you someone that we want to work with? That joy and sense of community and artistic excellence, if we don't have that as an ensemble, we can't communicate that to our audience. And so there's a lot of things that go into artistic excellence, not just their technique on their instrument.
That's so well said, you know, and what you're leaning into feeds perfectly into the question that I have for Abra. At the Peabody, you know, you're leading the development of the breakthrough curriculum, and from my understanding, to help address some of the things that Jeri and often others are talking about, this perceived disconnect between artistic excellence and expertise in other areas that are very important and relevant for today's professional orchestral musicians. So, Abram, can you talk a little bit about the breakthrough curriculum and what you're seeing in terms of numbers of minority students at Peabody, both who are matriculated there and also job placement upon graduation?
Sure. So first of all, it is such a pleasure to be here with all of you today and hear this conversation with your orchestral world. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm a singer by training, but I did have a few minutes in a youth orchestra playing flute as a young person. So it is really a pleasure to sort of hear some of the challenges, not only in the orchestral world, but some of those can also be mapped into other areas of music as well. So I appreciate this conversation a lot. So the breakthrough curriculum dates back about 5 years, honestly, and it came about as the direct result of a number of confluent factors that sort of came together and articulated. First, we had a new dean at the Peabody Institute who came from the orchestral world. Many of you may know my boss, Fred Bronstein, who was most recently at St. Louis Symphony before his last 7 years at Peabody. And he really came with the expectation that students in the conservatory sector needed to be able to do much of what all of you have talked about in terms of being able to deal with community and how you deal with asset-based community development and speaking within community, as well as the ability to speak about one's craft, career goals, artistic mission, and frankly, even just the music that we are playing and performing, right? I mean, I came through conservatory at a time when we didn't ever speak from the stage. We only just played our music. And so the expectation that students be able to really articulate and talk about their work was essential. At the same time, we did an alumni survey within Peabody that showed that there were significant gaps in the skills that our students knew or our alumni knew that they needed when they left. The SNAP data, if any of you are familiar with SNAP, it's an absolutely fantastic program run out of IU called the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project. They indicate that there are gaps in skill sets that our students need when they enter the professional world. There's a 65% gap in the category of financial and business management, and a 54% gap in skills with regard around entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial habits of mind. So with all of those things coming together, we developed a series of required courses, which the students were not too keen on, but we thought it was important for all of the students across the conservatory to first explore careers in the arts and take a look at the variety of careers within the 21st century, but also figure out how to place themselves within community. What does community mean? What does community mean either in Baltimore or in the places from which they derive? The second course is about how to build basic business skills, how to network, how to make sure you can speak about your artistic mission or your vision. And all of the students leave that class with a digital portfolio so that they can immediately turn their website on with an artist statement and be ready to launch into the world. And then the third class, as it is currently in place, pairs students with a grant project and have them learn to write a grant, but also give a pitch. And the students, then do a pitch off competition. And we actually fund some of those projects here within the community of Baltimore. Now, all of that being said, I couldn't agree more that today's musician, whether they be in the orchestral world or they be in some other facet of a performing arts career, need to have some of these soft skills around excellence, right? Excellence as a musician, excellence as a performer, excellence in artistry. Those are all things that we still hold at the center of a conservatory education, and the things that we hold true and hold up kind of the most in terms of preparation. But it's those skills around that make these people, all people, viable candidates for these orchestral jobs and frankly, opera jobs and anything else into the future. I want to say one other thing. There have been some data that have been striking to me that also sort of focus on this. The World Economic Forum published a report in October of this year that indicate that by 2025, most of us are going to need to learn we're going to need upskilling. We're going to need some kind of additional training in what it is we do, right? So think about the idea that, there are new tracks developing around citizen artistry within schools or within certificate programs, new tracks around teaching artistry, around asset-based community development, all sorts of ways in which we can interact with one another in heightened ways, as opposed to us just standing on the stage and performing our arias or playing our violins or standing behind a screen and having an audition. So even the World Economic Forum, has indicated that these are things that we are going to have to do in order to make sure that all of our careers are viable. And I argue that's nowhere more true than in this space. Now, you asked me one more question, and that's about student numbers. I'm sorry, I almost forgot that part. So I will tell you that at Peabody, we have radically changed where we are in terms of student numbers over the last 5 or so years. About 5 years ago, about 5% of our students were underrepresented minority students. That's the language of the Johns Hopkins University, Black and brown students primarily. Today, we're at about 17% of our students that are primarily Black and Latino. And we are at about the same percentage of faculty as well. All of that rapid change has come through very consistent attention being paid to how we recruit both students and faculty, how we interview them, and what kinds of expectations we have around their portfolios, both in terms of hiring portfolios and student portfolios. The students, to Ava's point, are there. They're very much there. They're excellent musicians. There is no need to ever compromise on quality. The same is true in the professoriate. There is no need to compromise quality. The people are there. It just sometimes takes a minute. And someone mentioned in the chat, you can't just reach out to the group of people you know. You need to actually dig around a little bit and not just rely on your networks, but think outside of your networks and work to build that group of people. I will finish with saying that one of the most incredible things that anyone has said to me in the last 5 years that I've been at Peabody is that a young African-American student walked up to me in the plaza and said, for the first time in my life, I have a Black male teacher. I've never had a Black male teacher. I've never seen somebody stand in front of me who is Black and male and conduct an orchestra. And he said, you know, these people are here and now they're here in such large numbers. I see a difference. And, you know, it takes intentionality and it takes determination, but those people are so ready to be there.
Thank you. And I want to move over to you, Kai, because of our panelists, you're the one who was most recently actually in school. Does what Abra is talking about in terms of the curriculum that they are teaching at Peabody and sort of the values and the way they're approaching instruction, does that align with what your experiences were, both for undergrad and your master's work as a bassoon performance major?
To some degree. I know in my undergrad, I was required to take an entrepreneurial musicianship course where we did talk about like creating a bio or creating a business, building a network, and doing some, entrepreneurial things. But I think some of the things that I think would have been beneficial to know are how can I be a good colleague? Like, what are the qualities of a good colleague? Like, I don't remember having any discussions in class, in any class setting where it's like, how do you take criticism professionally? How do you give constructive criticism in a way that is better for the collective environment and better for the excellent quality that you want to produce? And so I think I think the changes that music schools are making in terms of getting students to become more entrepreneurial and being able to speak about their music are very important skills. But I think there's still room to grow in filling these gaps between the professional field and the student field. And the entrepreneurial course I remember taking, it was required in undergrad. I didn't have anything like that was required in my master's. I know there was one course, but I didn't take it because I wanted to focus more on the performing aspects. I've always sort of been oriented towards an orchestral career. And so, yeah.
So let me go back to Afa. I see a lot of great comments in the chat that are really, moving towards trying to create a different model. And there's a lot of talk about community. I saw that you posted, about working with grant funders in order to change their expectations of the types of programs that they're actually funding. So how do we start to actually move from these kinds of conversations into an actual action plan that's inclusive of, current tenured musicians, and management at orchestras, but also the communities in which those orchestras are seated?
Yeah, $1 million question, or 10. I think some of the basic notions that must be challenged and done away with permanently include things like any sort of supposition of a compromised artistic merit. Whenever we start talking about representation or meaningful engagement surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is untrue, it is false, it cannot be possibly in any way substantiated. In fact, we should all accept, and I do think, in some ways, I so would love for our field, our sector, to simply engage in this meaningful work of representation and diversification for the intrinsic value of doing it. But I think we would agree that the past several decades or centuries have not really illustrated that. So I think, unfortunately, the setting of the culture does come from the top. At the moment, the top is not very representative. Actually, really no layer of management or leadership is. So I think those who are in a position of power have the wonderful honor of changing the tone of the conversation. They are the ones defining what is artistic merit. They're the ones who must redefine the myth and do away with the fact that somehow we're compromising artistic merit. They're the ones who should no longer settle for a concept of equity being a once or twice a year a nice engagement that maybe will feature a work by a living Black or Brown composer and call it a day. They're the ones who shouldn't settle for the Sierra pandemic, perhaps featuring a couple of elements of George Walker's lyric, beautiful piece, but okay, like there are volumes of like incredible music, right? And it does go beyond the Afro-American Symphony too. There's like volumes of really excellent music. We can't use the excuse of resources not being there. We can't use the excuse of not knowing how to find critical editions by music by Black and Brown composers. In fact, our leadership, that is the board, the C-suite folks, looking at you, all my friends all around the country, literally, I think must redefine or remind their communities that equity would mean 50-50. If we're talking about real equity, 50% of what is on my stage will be by non-white composers. I know that's like very shocking. So that's why on the Sphinx site, within the resources section, I'm only suggesting start with 15% and build that up. But absolutely, the vision should be, if you're talking equity, half of it should be that which is not familiar. That doesn't mean worse, it means better, because we will be that much richer for it. We will be that much more representative. We'll be that much more relevant. And we also know that our sector heavily relies on philanthropy. So we do call upon our philanthropic partners and leaders to change their practices, not only by making a once in a lifetime sort of announcement by granting and investing in programs that are BIPOC founded or led. That's awesome, yes, but also though holding each one of our organizations accountable for those things that we say we do to aid diversity and to evolve it. And if we don't quite do it in a manner that's consistent with our promises, then we shouldn't be funded for it. And I think that will also shift the paradigm. I know that's not done for the intrinsic value. It is not coming from sort of the soul of each orchestra, but it will come from the right place, because through incentive and motivation, it will assemble and coalesce all of our solidarity statements and now channel it into action. I do think it falls upon board leaderships to reinvent a priority list and say, we're absolutely prioritizing diversity and inclusion now, and we're doing it for a period of, I don't know however many strategic plans and cycles you want, at least 1 or 2, 5 to 10 years. We're prioritizing it. That means we're not going to assemble another committee or another ad hoc group or some add-on group of wonderful community volunteers whose word maybe gets heard but not prioritized and nothing ultimately changes. We basically are saying that this is now one of the top institutional priorities, and in fact these are the goals we're setting, and we're going to measure ourselves against it. There's been some conversation about cultural competency. I think that's really important. I also think that comes from the top. Leadership of institutions need to agree to work with their groups, with their teams, to redefine what is excellence. Every other field that's made more progress than we have assembles a group of people who don't look like one another, who don't think like one another, and come from different backgrounds, because it is believed that innovation and excellence cannot be achieved by people who think alike. So why don't we follow suit? Since we didn't innovate, we can at least follow a practice that could lead us someplace. And then I think important, somebody made an insightful comment, but I can't scroll up high enough, about the pipeline. There is a very unfortunate and convenient myth out there that somehow suggests we have a big pipeline issue. The reason I have a problem with it is because it's a human nature, it's within our sort of habits of human nature to blame something on something that's so far away that we can't really fix it. Oh, centuries of this, and this is so, it really starts in elementary schools. I mean, do I want to see music education accessible in every elementary schools? Absolutely, by all means, I would love that. I don't have the power to change that. What I can say is that look at the data, look at the statistics that do exist. The National Association for Schools of Music shows us that early music education in Sistema-inspired programs, community-based education, representation is far better there. Our schools, those early music education programs look like our communities. What does that say? It debunks in an instant the idea that somehow inherently the talent is not there. So the talent is there, the affinity is there. We're able to place instruments in the hands of young people and they do great. So what is then the problem? The drop off is by the time we get to youth ensembles and then undergraduate degrees and then onward to graduate degrees. So there was a comment earlier on made by Larry Williams about intentionality. Put intentionality around it. We see where the drop off is. So overinvest in that area. Take those talented young musicians, work with their families, establish trust, work in good faith, and work with your conservatories and music schools in such a manner to continue to dispel the myth of a lack of talent. Not a lack of talent, we just need to funnel this talent onward and include these young people in our institutions, in our musical collectives, so that they feel that they belong. The notion that anyone feels that they don't belong should be shameful to us as a field. So it's that engagement and that increased, the crescendo shaped engagement that needs to keep going, so that by the time we yell and scream at orchestras for not dealing with the right pool, not stepping outside their comfort field, we in fact have done everything we can to empower these young people who have gone through the pathway or the pipeline, so that we don't have this void, we don't have this dip and a drop off. So that's like some of the very basic things. They all constitute habits we need to develop, things we need to commit to, practices that are uncomfortable and difficult. And I want to say one small thing. We should all be prepared to get a little uncomfortable, or actually a lot uncomfortable. If we want different results, if it's not just a hollow rhetoric statement, then we should prepare ourselves to be uncomfortable. We should step outside of our comfort zone. We should engage with people with whom we don't normally engage. We should recruit from places we don't typically engage with. We should think outside the box, and we should think about it as not it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do if we actually care about the art form too. If you care to survive, nobody cares about how excellent another year of celebration of Beethoven is going to sound. If you're not playing it for anybody who matters, you're not playing it for your community. If the entire community feels you're irrelevant, it's all for naught, right? So I think understanding that it's a reciprocal relationship. For our art form to survive, it needs to be relevant. For it to be relevant, it needs to be excellent. It needs to be somehow it needs to matter, it needs to be of impact. And it's not of impact if it continuously both intentionally and unintentionally excluding. And then one small final thing to add, practices wise, our leadership isn't diverse. It's another myth to say, oh, there's just not enough people to hire into the C-suite and to decision making. Community engagement and directors of education positions at orchestras are at 2.5% in terms of representation of Black and Latinx. It's ridiculous. To think that that's because of talent would be, that's just fairy tales and myths. So, one of the pipelines, one of the programs that exists out there would be Sphinx's LEAD program. And I can tell you that in only 3 years of running this program, which is exactly that, C-suite preparation executive leadership program, 3 years of running it, applicant pool through the roof, increased by 42% within 1 year. There are 1 million people we could accept. There are definitely hundreds we could accept if there were resources. Selecting 10 or 11 every year, and the only limitation is because of how exclusive the program is, because of how much talent there is and how little resources. So there's definitely, I think it's all of those elements, and we have to think of it as central, mainstream, urgent right now. It cannot be an add-on. No more committees for consensus building, no more ad hoc volunteers from the community who are working alongside a couple of well-intentioned members of the board. Actually, at the very center, everyone's priority, everyone's doing it, otherwise it doesn't get done.
If I may just sort of underscore that, at Peabody, it is our belief that this is everyone's responsibility. And so all of the leadership have components of this in their work. and in their actual goals for each year, right? And so for us, it wasn't just relegated to a couple people off to the side or a particular committee. And I think that's the intentionality, one of the parts of the intentionality that we're talking about here. It absolutely has to just be core to the mission of everything you do every day, and not just something you do 3 or 4 days a month.
Can I just ask, there's something about, because we are coming out of this moment of this last year where we're having the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're seeing orchestras perform works by composers of color and Black composers specifically more often, but this hasn't been something that has happened continuously over the past. And so how can we hold the institutions accountable to say that this is the work that you are doing and we like this and it should continue? It is important to the development of the field and is important to the enrichment of your communities. Like, what are ways that you guys think that we should hold the institutions accountable?
So there's a number of ways to hold people accountable. And as someone who sits on a number of boards that fund arts organization, as well as an organization that receives funding from different organizations, for those of you out there in the audience as well, I would encourage you to take a look at the Tennessee Arts Commission's website about how they fund. They have taken a very clear stance about connecting arts organizations to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And they have a very important presentation that people have to certify that they've watched and that they, that they can document the diversity that they have in their institutions. There was a comment here, I'm going to read it out loud, from Martin Wolfhorst. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. He says, because of the nature of orchestral work, the idea of artistic homogeneity and uniformity is so deeply ingrained in the minds of orchestral musicians that philosophically the idea of diversity and nonconformity is alien to their thinking, a very difficult problem to solve. So first, I want to thank you for that comment, Martin. This is a critically important idea and concept, that when you're looking at arts organizations, particularly in the classical arts like ballet, like opera, like classical music orchestras, that you have to consider that these cultural expressions and institutions represent a worldview. These aren't just a mechanism for performing pieces of music, they represent a worldview. And so these ideas that Martin brings up in this are critical to understanding how we have to bring along the idea of change, and that when we appreciate the art form, anyone can appreciate the art form and buy into the traditions and the artistic merit of that art form. And they don't necessarily have to be from that culture to appreciate that. I mean, I think if you look at the way the Japanese culture has assimilated and loves and celebrates jazz music is an example of that people can recognize. And that's part of communicating the universality of this art form, that people from different cultures and backgrounds can love that art form and want to excel in it. And so you have to think about what constitutes uniformity, what constitutes diversity, because again, from a descriptive standpoint, maybe that diversity is disturbing, but from a more substantive point of view of diversity, you can have people who love the art form, who get into the culture of it, who celebrate that. And so that's an important thing. And so so going back, Kai, to your question about how do people kind of hold people's organizations' feet to the fire about these issues, one of the ways, again, and AFA spoke to this as well, one of the ways that from a philanthropic standpoint, people listen to money. And so if the people who control the pipeline of money are serious about this work, what they can do is start requiring organizations to report in on this and to provide actual numbers. And I can tell you, as someone who sits on the boards at a national level of an organization who has looked at grants from organizations across this country, people say they do diversity. People are applying for money for diversity work, but they don't have the numbers to support it, and they don't have any way of proving it, and yet they still get funding. And so unless and until people kind of take that example from the Tennessee Arts Commission and look at the fact that if you are not statistically able to demonstrate your activity and diversity, you will not receive money. This is an important way that people can then start to move that conversation and find, to AFA's and my point, different ways of motivating people to do this diversity work outside of the moral imperative. There is also a business imperative.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about that in terms of like my education, like it in terms of institution. I've like never learned about composers like Saint George Chevalier or Florence Price. Those were never taught in classes. It wasn't until I was involved with the African American student, later known as the Black Student Union at my undergrad, and it wasn't until we were putting on a concert where I started looking into composers like William Grant Still, who, you know, you hear them on the sidelines or you hear them like whisper, but unless you're like actually talking to someone who is engaged with that repertoire and the knowledge of people like him throughout history, like I would have never known about this. And I mean, I think that's a very important thing to see myself being represented in school, and even when I wasn't thinking about it at the time.
Absolutely. These are amazing. So I want to come over to you, Yark, because you actually are a performing musician in the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. So I would like for you to respond to Kai's point about holding people to feet to the fire, demanding change, and so forth. What is the role of a current musician, of a tenured musician in an orchestra, when it comes to creating a safe space to further diversify membership on stage?
Well, it's a little bit of a larger problem, in a sense that the average orchestra musician doesn't have really a lot of ways to provide feedback on a regular basis. So in other words, if you are playing in orchestra, very rarely is that you are being asked for your opinion about programming or things like this. So therefore it's a little bit of a situation, even and then that sort of creates like the certain level of inertia that people are just not even used to being asked about these issues or so. And I don't think it's really a problem of Hartford Symphony per se, but it's really like an industry standard, But if you think about it, there needs to change something on that level, because there's been so many studies that some of the major orchestras are, the bigger the orchestra, the more unhappy the players are, and that actually has been proven, by sociological studies. The level of professional satisfaction is much lower in the larger ensembles versus the smaller ensembles. So I would like to think that the solution somewhere also is related to the issue of training young musicians. So in a similar fashion as Berlin Philharmonic has the academy where they train their musicians, and not necessarily every single student that goes to the academy then will end up being a member of Berlin Philharmonic, but there's a very well established model of training orchestra musicians. So that's personally what I would like to see on say in the Hartford Symphony, where we have actually a training program for minority musicians, and then we and we are engaged in teaching them, and I think this way you can really make a meaningful change, if you spend time with those young people. That's I think that would be my inclination to go that way. I don't know if I exactly answered your questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. So there was a question in the chat from Fabian I saw a little bit ago, basically speaking to the idea of orchestras kind of coming together across the country to prioritize DEI, diverse representation on stage, and Fabian suggested sort of using the Paris Agreement as a model of coming together to do this, versus what I'm assuming that he's saying is the opposite, which is each orchestra is trying to address this on their own. So I'm curious what you all think about creating sort of a different standard, sort of like how the so-called, I'm going to use it in air quotes, the so-called blind audition has become somewhat standard across the country, but to what extent do all of you as panelists think that this is something that should be addressed more on a national scale, maybe through something like the League, versus something that each orchestra should figure out what are the right hiring practices for their particular orchestra?
if I may just really quickly, I mean, it's really difficult not to notice that we have a very large cultural problem on our hands, right? And then so there is a part of the society that doesn't really feel there is a particular need for change, right? And I'm sorry to even bring this up, but it's such a large, so if you're talking about, some sort of national level initiative, first of all, our society is so divided, at the very moment. I mean, how can we bring really a, meaningful national initiative if, and if we cannot even like talk to each other? I'm sorry to put it so bluntly. So my hope is that, the change will involve people actually talking to each other and listening to each other, right? Because in a nutshell, I mean, the people that are fierce defenders of the blind and the audition standard, they mean well. They talk about the fairness, right? So if there's a common interest, if there's this, prevailing interest of fairness, then maybe we can come together, but there has to be a dialogue, there has to be exchange of ideas, from the, not only with the people that think the same, like we are here on this panel and we are sort of, we have a similar kind of inclination, right? So unfortunately, I think the solution is pretty daunting, because the solution is really, for the society to, to really evolve and talk and listen.
Yeah, I just to add and respond, I think you're definitely right. There's a great deal of defensiveness and every reason in the world why folks don't want to change the status quo. And those who do not wish to change the status quo are pretty comfortable. They're in a position of privilege. We all have some amount of privilege. It just varies what type of privilege. I can say as somebody with good fortune and privilege, I can say that it isn't really an option for us not to change. And because what has been attempted so far has been so performative and incremental, we're not seeing particularly sweeping amounts of change from the 70s. So I think what is just logically clear, we can't do the status quo thing if we're gonna see any kind of changes, if we're going to ask for them. I also believe in my mind that it's a both and answer to Timothy's question, in that I think there needs to be a national effort. And there also needs to be a good deal of good faith effort on behalf of every self-respecting orchestra to also figure out what is possible and push that boundary within their own CBAs and within their own limitations and responses to their own communities. Why I think the individual piece is important is because we all have different communities. Detroit isn't the same as Santa Fe, not the same as Philly, even though we do have a pervasive across the board problem in that our most represented minority groups in the populations are most dramatically underrepresented. So people can come up with whatever acronyms, but Black and Latinx populations are very starkly and very disproportionately underrepresented in our own orchestras. Whatever you believe, stats speak for themselves. But I also think, and that's part of kind of my thinking in response to Anthony Tomasini's initial article, is that you cannot fix what you don't measure. And our orchestras don't really measure for whatever kind of excuses they come up with. And we don't track and measure exactly who shows up behind the screen. Anecdotally, we know it's not diverse, but also we don't measure. Until we measure, we can't really fix it. And what we do know also is that beyond not fixing what isn't measured, and I understand there's privacy laws and also, but there's also on paper nothing spelled out saying that you call and intentionally invite certain musicians to bypass certain rounds of your audition to come to the finals, and yet it is practiced. So there's what's on paper, and that is what actually occurs. And I'm like, yeah, well, every time there is an opportunity to bypass something, then hire the musicians, since you know there's not a lack of talent. Go and seek out the very best principal bassoonists and hire them. And like, end of story. And that would be, it is very important that your very next opportunity that is targeted be present it to a musician of color. Do everything you can to make the environment be authentically welcoming. And I think one of the other ways in which I think it needs to be done as a national model is that we are a field of followers. I know we don't like to admit that, but it's just the case. Somebody tries something, and if it works and if it's funded, how many orchestras started to replicate the concept of African-American fellowships? I don't know, too many to count. Why? Was it all because it was something that was being funded in the field? So if we're able to replicate that, then replicate the practice of what's going to lead us to some kind of actual notable change that goes beyond incrementalism. So as such, I know the National Alliance for Audition Support, in partnership with the League and New World Symphony and about 82 orchestras, is trying to develop best practices for orchestras. Those practices include measuring and understanding your audition pool. It also sets certain, I know a lot of my colleagues don't like it when I talk in terms of numbers because it sounds like quotas, but you know what? If you don't have numbers, you're not gonna meet any goals. So yes, it absolutely says that in order to hire in a way it's going to result in diverse hires and diverse musicians of backgrounds unlike the common backgrounds joining your orchestra, is that at least half of your actual audition pool needs to be represented by musicians who are Black and Brown by heritage. In order for that to happen, your recruitment efforts need to be lopsided like never before. You need to recruit heavily in those communities so that you can start maybe with 70% down to 50%. So in your finals, at least 25% of your auditionees, finalists, are actually Black and Brown. And the same goes for every hire on the staff side of the orchestras. So yeah, I think that having best practices and as much as possible having those honored and adhered to, so that we were holding ourselves and each other accountable, is going to be important. Because I do think if we leave it to just individual orchestras, there will be every reason found for why not to do something differently.
Yeah, if I may speak to your point, Afa, I think a lot of, and I'm going to make an assumption here, but I think a lot of orchestra musicians are not engaged with a lot of conversation around diversity on what actually is going on between like the administrative side and the work that they're doing. And so I think it's up to the musicians who are sort of in those conversations to also be in conversation with their colleagues so that there can be a common ground and a common language and just an understanding of all of the different facets that are going on, so that they can be measured and that you can eventually get the data so that people can actually share it around.
It's so very true. I mean, I think that's one of the other ways in which I think the National Alliance is trying to make a difference. I think there's lots of musicians who are not involved, and like-minded musicians who are not involved, and it falls upon the shoulders of the players committees and those who are actually sitting behind the screen. But what I do know is that we can't exclude anyone from the conversation. We all need to be thinking differently and leading. And if anyone holds any sort of modicum of power, they need to shift, make the leap. I know it feels all risky. It's just, it's the only way. Once we make some of those initial shifts, we'll make a few mistakes. We'll find that certain things aren't thought through enough, but we're at least shifting away from status quo. And I think that's you're very right. And if there's anyone, it also falls upon people who are not involved to step forward and demand to be involved. It's, I think all of those people who care about the issue need to be heard.
And to that point, also being involved with your community in these discussions too, because I'm in Minneapolis. So like we just had the shooting with George Floyd a few months ago. And so being in the orchestra, like I know that some of the musicians hadn't had a conversation about the diversity efforts that have been going on within the organization, but then also to have that compounded by the fact that there is so much racial trauma and injustice going on in your own city. Just like it's a sort of compounding effect. And we live in this bubble, like even in my education where it's like, you don't see this representation and the impact that it has on the field itself. It needs to change.
So true.
Jeri, I'm curious, as you know, somebody who's actually started an orchestra, your thoughts about the intentionality around diversity. And I know that you earlier you have a very kind of expansive definition of diversity. But I'm so curious from a music director's perspective, in terms of, you know, balancing artistic, you know, qualities, but also these other characteristics that we're talking about. You know, what your thoughts are around, and I sort of hate to use this word, but around quotas, around measuring and tracking, you know, the applicants for certain positions.
Certainly. You know, I think I probably come at this from a different perspective. My organization was not founded to address problems within my organization. My organization was founded as a model where these problems don't exist. And so my framework for understanding and how to think about these things, I would say in a traditional point of view, Black Pearl has about 25% of each kind of racial, cultural, ethnic group writ large. And so we're able to report out on a lot of these things. But my process for selecting musicians, because my core is already diverse, that gives us access to diverse options as well. And so what you find is that when you have a foundation of diversity, it makes it easier to increase or deal with diversity in these kinds of things and to be much more nuanced about it. It is important from a music director's standpoint, for you as someone who is making the highest artistic decisions, to make the decisions that will send the message to the audience that there is no daylight between artistic excellence and diversity. Those two things, again, are not mutually exclusive. And because of the point that I made earlier, that orchestras are worldviews, the medium becomes the message. Orchestras can talk about diversity all they want. They can have all the initiatives that they want. What the audience sees are the people on the stage. They don't see the orchestra librarian who was just hired. They don't see all these kinds of things. What they see are the people on the stage. And if they do not see themselves represented on that stage, it doesn't matter what an orchestra says. The medium is the message. The message is, we are not diverse. You are not welcome. You are not part of this world. And so orchestras in America need to decide, are we American institutions or are we leftover European institutions? Once we decide what our identity is, we can then move forward, like Afa is talking about, like Jeri is talking about, with these uncomfortable but very necessary and empowering conversations. Someone talked about in the chat, racial healing. This is exactly what people really need. If we can engage, to Jeri's point about engaging in these healing conversations, just like this one that the HSO is hosting, where we can be honest and talk about uncomfortable things in a very positive and engaging and empowering way, that is going to begin the cycle of transformation. Where we are right now is what I want to call a little bit beyond diversity, like 1.0. where people are talking about quotas, people are talking about numbers, people are talking about initiatives that were actually started back in 1965. The Music Assistance Fund was started by the League of American Orchestras and the New York Philharmonic, and also involved the Minnesota Orchestra Chi. So you're part of a larger initiative that was started almost 55 years ago. And to Apa's point earlier, if we don't start doing things differently, we are not going to see these different results. And so this kind of radical shift, what is our role in American society? Are we upholding 18th century European values? Or are we upholding 21st century American values? And let that be the starting point of your perspective about how to pursue diversity, who to engage in that conversation.
So as we start to get towards the end of our panel, I'm curious if each of one of you would share one thing that you would like to see change in the hiring practices for musicians at American orchestras, whether it's you know, drop the screen, make the whole audition process actually more blind, to your initial point, Afa, whether it's you know, as a couple of you have mentioned, there are many orchestras who are initiating diversity fellowships and creating opportunities for up and coming Black and Brown musicians to get into professional orchestras. Is there one thing that each one of you would like to speak to that you would absolutely like to see change in the hiring practice. And let me start first over with Abra because you're in the education space. And so I'm curious, like, as you're training students to go out there into the field, Abra, what are things that you would like to see change?
I think that for me, the sort of acknowledgement that an orchestral job, an orchestral career is more than just playing Beethoven would be a great place to start. And that musicians need to be hired for reasons other than just their ability to play their violin. And to really own that, as Kai said, it was a great experience for him to actually go through an interview process, not just a playing exam. So for me, I would like to see that. But the other thing I would say is, I'm as I listen to these conversations, especially over the last 6 months or so, I'm consistently not shocked, but saddened by the lack of ownership of so many C-suite people in the field to really make a change. Change is really hard, but we can do it, and we have the ability to do it. And yet there are so many people that are still wringing their hands and saying, well, we can't play, we can't program 15 to 20% of our music by Black and Brown composers because the audiences won't come, or we don't know how to greater diversify the orchestra. And in fact, there are models out there. So I challenge my colleagues who sit in C-suite areas around the performing arts to really own this at themselves, and for all of those folks in leadership to own it, because I think that's the only way we're going to make a difference.
Thank you. Kai, I'm going to go to you next. Something that you would absolutely like to see changed in the hiring process as somebody who's out there working to get a job right now.
Put the screen up the whole time. I think that's what I have to say to that. And to, I guess my other point would, for orchestras to address the culture within themselves in order to have those conversations and to implement those changes.
Thank you. Jarek, how about you as somebody who's in an orchestra?
Well, I think the general, model of symphony orchestra is getting a little tired. Like basically the roles of the musicians need to be redefined, and so the way I see it is as basically redefining those roles and energizing the membership of the orchestra, and then have them engage in the educational process. So education, and then reimagining the role of the orchestra musician is where I would like to see the change.
Jeri, same question to you.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say, if I don't get the chance, thank you so much again. I've enjoyed listening to all of the panelists, and if I see distracted, I'm trying to keep up with the chat. There's just a lot happening there. And so I want to finish with something in the chat critically important that Michko brought up. And Michko Singh, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing names on here, but she talks about not just the audition process, but the tenure process within that. And so again, one of the things, and I'm going back to the business and the economics of this right now, we are coming out of a very difficult, hopefully, pandemic in 2021. A lot of organizations are going to be hard hit financially, and a lot of musicians are going to be grateful to keep their jobs if they still have one coming out of this. If there are no jobs, it doesn't matter about the pipeline. It doesn't matter how diverse it is. There simply won't be places for people to play. And so there is, I think, an element in terms of the change. There is an element of entrepreneurship. Again, Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra, a little bit different. We do not have a collective bargaining agreement with our musicians. They might be members of the union, but we do not have a bargaining agreement with them, which allows us a little bit of freedom to pivot in these times and allow our musicians to be creative in ways that maybe the union would not allow them to do. And then we can continue to pay them and support them. And so there is a structural element between the economics, how unions operate, and how many jobs are available that is going to also impinge, I think, upon this issue of diversity.
Thank you so much. And Afa, we'll end it back with you where we started. Your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. And I loved and appreciated so much of what we saw in the comments and the generous contributions from the panel. I think just to correct or add to a bit of your characterization of my summary is not that we just make the auditions more blind. I absolutely believe the audition itself is only one step that is a necessary part within other units of measurement as we assess one's fitness to enter a musical collective that is an orchestra. I think my solution is audition, blind audition plus. The plus is equally as important. I just don't have an eloquent name for it. But if I had to say one thing in terms of changing it, I personally and professionally on every level, I believe, just do it. I want to see orchestras look like the communities in which they reside, period. If they remove the screen and do it, I will say hallelujah. If they keep the screen up the whole time and actually invest their hard-earned dollars into gaining other competencies, inviting people who actually are representative of these communities and can assess someone's readiness and fitness to be an ambassador and cultural leader and a citizen and a teaching artist, I say hallelujah. Whichever way we get there, if they call in and diversify an orchestra until there's a sweeping change and then go into a revised model, I still say hallelujah. Just do it. Do not let another year go by and for us to have another one of these panels a year later and say, well, look, guess what? Okay, we've made one placement. Can't happen. Won't happen. Just it's not possible. So I would say the only real commitment is change and do it and work toward representation. Don't make it incremental. Don't assemble 55 different committees. Don't come to a consensus. Just do it. Work towards it and make it happen.
Just do it. What a great note to end on. I want to thank all of our esteemed panelists today. And also, and Jeri, you mentioned earlier, trying to keep up with the chat. It's been a really engaging conversation. I'm looking forward to actually saving the chat and being able to dissect some of the comments more deeply in a moment. I do want to encourage everybody to please stay in touch with the Hartford Symphony. We're committed to this process. We know many orchestras across the country are working on these issues as well. Let's work together. Be in touch with the National Alliance for Audition Support, a great organization. And everybody stay safe and healthy and have a happy holiday season. And thank you so much for joining today's conversation. Bye-bye.